When fans look back on the Beatles, they often think of unmatched musical chemistry, but behind the scenes of the world's most famous band, tensions simmered long before their official breakup in 1970. The seeds were sown years earlier. Today, I've just chosen some specific events just to help expose some secretive feuds and arguments within the band that eventually tore them apart. If you love the videos that I put out, the only way for me to grow is for you to smash like and hit subscribe. So it's easy to overlook Ringo Starr in the internal tension of the Beatles, but his departure during the 1968 White Album sessions showed that even the most lovable Beatle could be pushed too far. Tensions were running high in the band as they recorded at Abbey Road, with each member increasingly working on their songs alone, and everybody was fighting for creative control. Ringo especially felt alienated. He reportedly believed that his drumming wasn't good enough and sensed that the others, especially Paul, were criticising his playing. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted from the laugh-a-minute of the early years to rivalry. George Martin later said that the White Album sessions were a terrible time for the band. During recording, engineers were told to go for a walk or go for a cup of tea while the Beatles bickered amongst each other. On August 22nd, 1968, Ringo had had enough. He threw his hands up and walked out, quitting the band entirely. "I couldn't take it anymore," he later said. "There was no magic and the relationships were terrible." Ringo understood his role in the band, a role not a lot of musicians of his standing could have fulfilled, but during these sessions, he felt like he was too much of a pawn and was fed up with the way he was being treated and ignored, literally just sitting around waiting for the band to be ready for him. So Ringo took his family on a holiday to Sardinia on Peter Sellers' yacht. The rest tried to carry on without him. In his absence, Paul played drums on tracks like Back in the USSR and Dear Prudence, but they all quickly realised that his drumming was the centre of gravity for their songs, and his attitude and personality bound them all together. Eventually, the other Beatles convinced him to return. They sent him a telegram saying, "You're the best rock and roll drummer in the world. Come on home, we love you." Didn't take much convincing for him to come back. When he came back to the studio, his drum kit was decorated with flowers by Mel Evans at George's insistence, an olive branch from his bandmates. He came back on September the 9th, straight into recording the Beatles' heaviest song to date, Helter Skelter. They told him to pound the drums as loud and as fast as he could. At the end of the 18th take, he screamed, "I got blisters on my fingers!" Despite his return though, the damage had been done. Ringo's departure demonstrated that even the most stoic member of the group could reach their breaking point.
You felt when those three guys were all together, they had bonded somehow.
That was the White Album.
Right. That's where you walked out of the Beatles.
No,
You were like, hey, fuck you guys.
I only went out because I did feel like it was, we'd done Pepper and that was fine. And we were trying to be a band again, which I love.
Right.
And then I'm there in the studio and it's like, I don't feel good. I don't feel part of it. So I go and knock on John's door and I say, "Hey, I just don't feel right. I don't feel it, I'm part of this. You three seem so close." And he goes, "I thought it was you three."
Right.
So I said, okay, I go and knock on Paul's door and I tell him the same thing. I don't feel part of this. I feel you three are so close. And he goes, "I thought it was you three."
Right.
So I said, fuck it, I'm off.
By 1969, George Harrison was no longer happy to stand in the shadow of Lennon and McCartney. He had matured as a songwriter. But despite his creativity growing, he continued to face pushback from Paul and John, both of whom often played down his musical ideas. He felt Paul was an insufferable dictator who was telling you what to play and how to play it. "I'd always let him have my way," George later said, even when that meant songs which I had composed were not being recorded. The Let It Be sessions quickly turned into a hot pot of tension. During the second week, George's patience went, particularly at Paul. Filmed rehearsals captured the moments of them fighting, now including the now infamous exchange between George and Paul. Paul was frustrated with George's playing, so George then said, "I'll play what you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to." At lunchtime, the two Beatles squared off in the canteen. George felt degraded. Paul felt that George was just being petty. George then snapped and on January the 10th stormed out of the studio, telling the rest of them that he'll see them round the clubs. Yoko immediately took up George's empty chair while they jammed. John didn't seem to care about George leaving. He told Michael Lindsay Hogg that the band should continue, and if George doesn't want to come back, they'll just ask Eric Clapton to join. On Sunday the 12th, they all met at Ringo's house and tried to bury the hatchet, but George still couldn't figure it out with them and stomped out halfway through and headed back to Liverpool for a visit. The rest of the band tried to shrug it off, but continuing without George was going to be too difficult. On the following Wednesday, George laid down his rules for his return. Despite contributing several strong songs to the Let It Be project, George often remained sidelined, and tracks like All Things Must Pass were rejected, only to become iconic hits on his solo album months later. The dynamic between George and Lennon and McCartney had permanently shifted, so it was quite clear that the so-called quiet Beatle was done with staying quiet. One of the earliest glimpses into the band's interpersonal conflict occurred during the 1966 recording of She Said, She Said, which is a psychedelic track from Revolver. It was inspired by an LSD-fueled conversation Lennon had had with actor Peter Fonda. During the recording session, Paul McCartney abruptly left the studio. In later interviews, he had confirmed that he'd had an argument with the others and walked out, leaving John and George to finish the track without him. George played bass in Paul's absence. It appears that tensions flared between Paul and John over the arrangement of the song during this session. A recording sheet in the Abbey Road archives mentions a piano being added, which is quite likely Paul's idea, yet it's neither listed on the tape box nor audible on the session tapes. Given John's strong preference for raw rock and roll, guitars, bass and drums, it might have been Paul's suggestion of the piano which sparked the disagreement. According to accounts, the argument escalated and Paul exclaimed, "You," and stormed out of the studio, skipping the remainder of the session ahead of their scheduled trip to West Germany the following day. She Said, though, turned out to be one of the standout tracks on Revolver, but the incident behind it quickly revealed how each songwriter saw their vision. You see, Paul wanted a piano, but John, as it was his song and he felt it was his song, didn't want one on the track. I think this is quite a good indication of the beginning of the end of their collaborative nature, when each songwriter kind of started going down their own path. And also as well, it was an early sign of what would become the norm in the band's final years, writing and recording songs almost separately. Look, before I start on this one, I want to do one or maybe several deeper episodes into this topic, but I couldn't help but not mention it on today's video. But just don't expect too much from me, as to get really into the meat and bones on this particular topic of Beatles lore, I really need to do a hell of a lot more reading. But I'll give you the gist. For me, if one event truly cemented the Beatles' demise, it was the hiring of controversial manager Alan Klein. After the death of their original manager Brian Epstein in 1967, the band drifted without a clear business direction. Paul advocated for Lee and John Eastman, who were soon to be his in-laws, to manage the group. John, George and Ringo, however, threw their support behind Klein, who was a brash American manager known for working with the Rolling Stones. Klein promised to stabilise Apple Corps, which was the Beatles' chaotic multimedia company, and negotiate better royalties. John was especially taken with Klein, but Paul was deeply suspicious of Klein's aggressive methods and his style. The disagreement created a major rift within the band. Paul eventually refused to sign a management contract with Klein, leading to a standoff that only further poisoned the band. Paul felt outnumbered and betrayed, and his growing isolation was matched by his increasing desire to control the band's direction. Paul was really desperate to become the band leader. The situation eventually led to Paul's lawsuit to dissolve the Beatles in 1970. Though it was framed as a legal requirement, the suit was still a declaration of war, cementing his split from the group entirely. The decision to do this made it much harder to keep good relationships with the others. Ironically, Paul's instincts were later vindicated. Klein was sued by Apple Corps in 1973 and forced to pay back hundreds and thousands of pounds. Thanks very much for watching, guys. For me, what makes these feuds so fascinating is that they rarely played out in the public at the time. Like, I didn't even know about Paul storming out during the She Said until I started my research for this video. Of course, it's all very well documented now, as there's so many books and documentaries delivered to us, leaving almost no stone unturned. But at the time, the fans saw the mop-tops smiling on album covers, not the creative tug-of-war behind the scenes. There's literally hundreds of little stories like this that I've not included today. Maybe another day, who knows, I might do another one of these little videos. But if you're a Beatles nut like me, or even just a newbie fan, you can click on the link to my video about the song Ticket to Ride, and I'll see you in the next one.